Imagine the year 844. The coasts of Europe are burning. From the mist-shrouded monasteries of Northumbria to the rich riverbanks of the Seine, a new kind of terror has arrived from the north. To the people of the Frankish Empire and the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, these men are not just raiders, they are a divine punishment. They are the Vikings. They appear from the fog, strike with surgical precision, and vanish before a local lord can even saddle his horse. For decades, the Northmen have operated under a simple, brutal reality. No one can stand against them in open battle, and no city is too fortified to be sacked. But as their longships pushed further south, past the familiar hunting grounds of the English Channel and toward the sun-drenched coasts of the Iberian Peninsula, they were about to make a catastrophic mistake. They were sailing into the heart of the Emirate of Cordoba, the most sophisticated, wealthy, and militarily advanced superpower in Western Europe. The Vikings expected another easy harvest of gold and slaves. Instead, they were about to encounter a civilization that didn't just fight back. It looked at the dragon ships and decided to erase them from the map. This is the story of the time the Vikings met a superpower and the brutal lesson they learned at the gates of Seville.
To understand why this clash was so different, you have to understand who was sitting on the throne in Cordoba. This wasn't a fractured kingdom of squabbling counts. This was the Umayyad Emirate of Cordoba, ruled by al-Rahman II. While the rest of Europe was struggling through the so-called Dark Ages, Cordoba was a beacon of the Islamic Golden Age. It was a land of philosophers, scientists, and professional soldiers. al-Rahman wasn't just a religious leader. He was a master of logistics and statecraft. He presided over a standing army and a complex intelligence network. When the first reports reached him of strange, narrow-waisted ships with striped sails hovering off the coast of Lisbon, he didn't panic. He watched. He waited. The Vikings, led by commanders who had likely participated in the great heathen army's exploits, saw the Atlantic coast of Iberia as a land of untapped riches. They had already raided the Christian north, hitting the kingdom of Asturias, but they found the terrain rugged and the resistance surprisingly stiff. So they turned their prows southward, toward the land the Arabs called Al-Andalus. They sailed up the Guadalquivir River, the watery artery leading straight into the heart of one of the peninsula's greatest prizes, Seville, then known as Historlly. For the Vikings, a river was a highway to an open vault. They had done this in Paris. They had done this in London. They expected Seville to be no different. As the fleet of roughly 80 ships moved inland, the local governors were caught off guard. The speed of the Viking longships was their greatest weapon. Before a proper defense could be organized, the Northmen landed at the port of Seville. What followed was 3 days of absolute carnage. The city, which lacked significant walls at the time, was overwhelmed. The Vikings did what they did best. They looted the great mosque, they took the women and children as captives, and they turned the streets into a slaughterhouse. To the Vikings, it seemed like business as usual. They set up a base camp at Isla Menor, a marshy island in the river, and began processing their loot, likely laughing at how easily the southern men had folded. But they had misjudged their enemy. They thought they had broken the city, but all they had done was wake a sleeping giant. While the Vikings were busy sorting through silver and silk, messengers were riding through the night to Cordoba.
al-Rahman II didn't send a diplomatic envoy. He didn't offer Danegeld to make him go away. He summoned his leading general, Muhammad ibn Rustam, and gave a single order: destroy them. This is the moment where the Viking myth meets the reality of professional warfare. The Umayyad response was a masterpiece of medieval mobilization. The emir didn't just call up a few peasants with pitchforks. He deployed the Jund,
the professional corps of the Syrian and Yemeni military castes, along with a massive levy of local volunteers fueled by a desire for revenge. But it wasn't just about numbers, it was about technology. The Umayyads had inherited the military traditions of the Roman and Persian empires. They understood siegecraft, they used sophisticated scouting, and most importantly, they had access to a terrifying weapon, Greek fire. This was a liquid incendiary that could burn on water and stick to the hulls of wooden ships. The Vikings, whose entire culture revolved around the safety and speed of their vessels, had never seen anything like it. As the Vikings prepared to move further inland toward Cordoba itself, they found the landscape had changed. Every village was a fortress, every hill held a scout. Ibn Rustam's army didn't rush into a head-on collision. He played a game of cat and mouse, shadowing the Viking movements, cutting off their foraging parties, and slowly squeezing them back toward the river. The Northmen, used to the wide open spaces of the North Sea, began to feel the heat, both literally and figuratively. The climax of this collision occurred at a place called Tablada, just outside Seville. The Vikings, sensing the trap closing, decided to make a stand. They formed their famous shield wall, a tactic that had broken the lines of every English king for a generation. They stood shoulder to shoulder, a wall of interlocking wood and iron, shouting their battle cries to Odin. But the Umayyads didn't play by the rules of northern warfare. Instead of crashing into the shield wall, the Umayyad cavalry, fast, light, and deadly, harassed the Viking flanks with horse archers. Then the heavy infantry moved in. The battle was long and incredibly bloody, but the Umayyads had a secret weapon: catapults. They began raining down containers of Greek fire and heavy stones onto the Viking positions. Imagine the psychological shock. These were men who believed that if they died in battle, they would go to Valhalla. But there is nothing heroic about being burned alive by a fire you cannot extinguish. The shield wall, the legendary formation of the Viking Age, began to buckle under the weight of a superior, mechanized military force. When the line finally broke, it wasn't a retreat, it was a massacre. Ibn Rustam's forces showed no mercy. Contemporary accounts claim that over 1,000 Vikings were killed on the field. More importantly, 30 of their precious longships were captured or burned. To the Vikings, the loss of a ship wasn't just a loss of transport. It was a loss of their home, their status, and their only way out. The survivors fled back to their remaining vessels, but the Umayyads weren't done. They pursued them down the river, the banks lined with archers and catapults. The invincible Northmen were being hunted like animals. The aftermath of the Battle of Tablada sent shockwaves through the Viking world. They had encountered a civilization that was not only richer than them, but also more disciplined and more ruthless. The captured Vikings weren't just held for ransom. Many were executed, their heads hung from the palm trees of Seville as a warning to any other fleet that dared to enter the Guadalquivir. It was a clear message. Al-Andalus is not England. Al-Andalus is not Francia. Here, you are the prey. But the story doesn't end with a battle. This is where it gets truly fascinating. al-Rahman was a man of intellect. He wanted to know who these Majus, the term the Arabs used for the Vikings, actually were. Instead of just closing his borders, he sent a diplomatic mission to the north. He dispatched a famous poet and diplomat named Yahya ibn al-Hakam al-Bakri, known as Al-Ghazal, the Gazelle, because of his grace and wit. Al-Ghazal traveled to the court of a Viking king, likely in Denmark or Ireland. His accounts are some of the most surreal and vivid descriptions of Viking life ever recorded by an outsider. He writes about the Viking queen, who was surprisingly independent and charmed by the sophisticated Arab diplomat. He describes their customs with a mix of horror and fascination. This diplomatic exchange represents a rare moment in history where two completely different worlds tried to look each other in the eye.
However, the military lesson stuck. For the next century, whenever Viking fleets appeared off the coast of Iberia, they found a very different welcome. Abd al-Rahman ordered the construction of a permanent navy and a chain of watchtowers and shipyards along the Atlantic coast. He turned the emirate into a maritime power specifically to counter the Viking threat. When the Vikings returned in 859, led by the legendary Bjorn Ironside and Hasting, they found a coast that was locked down. They managed to pull off some raids, even reaching the Mediterranean and hitting Morocco and Italy, but they never again managed to sack a major Andalusian city. They had learned that in the south, the easy gold came with a price they couldn't afford to pay. So why don't we hear more about this? In the standard Western history book, the Vikings are the main characters of the 9th century. We hear about the siege of Paris and the Danelaw in England, but the failure at Seville is just as important. It proves that the Vikings weren't an unstoppable force of nature. They were opportunistic raiders who succeeded primarily when their enemies were divided or technologically stagnant. When they hit a wall, a unified, professional, and scientifically advanced superpower, they crumbled. The raid on Seville changed the Vikings, and it changed Al-Andalus. It forced the Umayyads to look toward the sea, leading to the creation of a navy that would dominate the Western Mediterranean for years. And for the Vikings, it was a harsh reminder that the world was much larger and much more dangerous than the cold northern waters they called home. They came to Seville as wolves, but they left as survivors, lucky to have escaped a fire they didn't know how to fight. It's a reminder that history isn't just about who is the strongest, but who can adapt the fastest. The Vikings were masters of the sea, but the Umayyads were masters of the state. And in 844, the state won.